What if the biggest advantage in life isn't being stronger or smarter or even more talented than everyone else? What if it's simply understanding how the human mind quietly influences every decision people make? Every day, people believe they're making completely independent choices. They think they're acting on logic, following their own opinions, and deciding what they truly want. But psychology suggests something far more surprising. Many of the decisions we make are influenced by subtle psychological patterns that most people never notice. The people who understand these patterns often seem unusually persuasive, not because they force anyone to do anything, but because they understand how the mind naturally works. In this video, we'll explore 5 psychological techniques that reveal how influence really works. Each one becomes progressively more powerful, and the final technique may completely change the way you think about everyday conversations. You might not be ready for the last one, but let's begin. Sign 5. You give people the illusion of choice. The first psychological pattern is surprisingly simple. People naturally resist being controlled. The moment they feel someone is forcing a decision on them, their brain begins looking for reasons to say no. But something changes when they believe the choice is theirs. Instead of telling someone exactly what to do, offer 2 acceptable options. Instead of asking, "Can you help me?" you might ask, "Would you rather do it today or tomorrow?" Both answers move in the same direction, yet the other person still feels a sense of control. Psychologists often refer to this as the illusion of choice. It doesn't remove someone's freedom. It simply works with the mind's natural desire for autonomy. That's why this technique appears so often in sales, leadership, parenting, and everyday conversations. The decision feels voluntary, even though the outcome remains remarkably similar. But this is only the beginning, because the next psychological pattern becomes even more powerful once someone has already agreed with you. Sign 4. The power of small agreements. The next psychological pattern builds on the first. Once people say yes to something small, they're often more willing to continue saying yes. Why? Because the human mind naturally prefers to stay consistent with its previous decisions. Imagine asking someone for a huge favor immediately. They'll probably hesitate. But if they first agree to something simple, answer a quick question, or help with a small task, the next request often feels far less difficult. Each small agreement quietly changes how they see themselves. Instead of thinking, "I'm someone who says no," their mind begins telling a different story. "I'm already helping." That's why experienced negotiators, skilled leaders, and persuasive communicators rarely begin with their biggest request. They start with the smallest one. One simple agreement becomes the foundation for the next. But even this technique isn't as powerful as what comes next, because the next psychological pattern doesn't rely on agreement at all. It relies on silence. Sign 3. Silence makes people reveal more. Most people believe the best way to control a conversation is to keep talking. But psychology suggests something very different. Silence often creates far more pressure than words ever can. Imagine asking someone an important question. Instead of immediately filling the awkward pause, you simply wait. For many people, silence feels uncomfortable. Their brain naturally wants to remove that discomfort as quickly as possible. So they keep talking. They explain more than they intended, reveal information they never planned to share, or even begin justifying themselves without being asked. The silence itself quietly encourages them to fill the empty space. This is why experienced negotiators, interviewers, and skilled communicators often become comfortable saying less instead of more. They understand that silence isn't empty. It's psychological pressure. And the person who becomes comfortable with silence often learns far more than the person who keeps speaking. But even silence isn't the strongest psychological pattern, because the next one changes the way people remember an entire conversation. Sign 2. Repetition quietly shapes belief. One of the most surprising psychological patterns has nothing to do with arguments. It has to do with repetition. Most people assume they believe something because they carefully examine the evidence. But in reality, the human mind is often influenced by familiarity. The more often we hear the same idea, the more natural it begins to feel. A statement repeated once may sound doubtful. Repeated 10 times, it starts feeling strangely familiar. And familiar ideas are often easier for the brain to accept than completely new ones. That's one reason advertisers repeat the same message. Brands repeat the same slogan. And public figures often return to the same phrases again and again. They're not simply sharing information. They're making the idea easier for your brain to recognize. Recognition can quietly influence how believable something feels, which is exactly why paying attention to repeated messages matters. But there is one psychological technique that is even more powerful than repetition. Because it doesn't depend on what you say, it depends on what you don't say. Sign 1. People trust what they discover themselves. The most powerful psychological pattern isn't about speaking better. It's about speaking less. Most people try to persuade others by giving answers. But psychology suggests a different approach. People are far more likely to believe an idea when they feel they discovered it themselves. Instead of telling someone what to think, ask the right question. Instead of saying, "You're wrong," you might ask, "What makes you so certain?" Or, "What evidence changed your mind?" The conversation immediately becomes different. They're no longer defending themselves against your opinion. They're examining their own thinking. And when people reach a conclusion on their own, they're far more likely to accept it. That's why the most persuasive communicators often spend less time making statements and more time asking thoughtful questions. Because real influence rarely comes from forcing people to change. It comes from helping them discover a new perspective for themselves. And that is the psychological technique most people never expect. If there is one thing to remember after watching this video, it is this. The most persuasive people are not always the loudest. They are not always the smartest. And they are rarely the ones trying the hardest to control everyone around them. They simply understand how the human mind naturally works. They offer choices instead of pressure. They build agreement one small step at a time. They become comfortable with silence. They recognize the quiet influence of repetition. And they ask questions that help people discover the answer for themselves. Real influence isn't about manipulation. It's about understanding the psychology behind everyday conversations. The moment you stop trying to force people to change and start working with the way the mind naturally makes decisions, everything about your communication begins to change. If this video gave you a new perspective, comment the number 5 below. Let's see how many people have realized that the strongest influence doesn't come from controlling people. It comes from understanding them.